Orson Welles has pretty much universally been considered one of the greats when it comes to acting and directing, but the kudos he has received as a writer has always had something of a question mark over it.
In 1971, an American critic, Pauline Kael, published her account of the writing of Kane, together with a shooting script. She paid particular attention to Welles' co-writer, Herman Mankiewicz, and drew some devastating conclusions based on the evidence of a couple of Mankiewicz associates. One of them, his secretary, is quoted as saying that Welles did not write or dictate one line of the shooting script of Citizen Kane.
I am very happy to accept this award in the manner in which the screenplay was written, which is to say, in the absence of Orson Welles.
But more about that in a minute.
He claims, though unfortunately there's no evidence for this whatever, that as a young man in his teens, a boy more or less, and then as an adolescent, that he'd written pulp fiction.
I happen to like Orson tremendously. For what? I think Orson Welles is a very brilliant director. All I find with Orson Welles, and I have told him so many times, he thinks he's a writer. He is not a writer.
Orson Welles, for those who don't know, was something of a wunderkind for the theatre. Setting up his own company while still in his early 20s and shaking the stale theatrical world with his radical adaptations of classic literature. Orson soon became the toast of the New York scene with his booming baritone voice and a gift for hitting a performance dead on while only sight-reading the text. He was made for a move into radio drama.
His own radio show, the Mercury Theatre on the Air, was winning rave reviews, but nobody seemed to be listening. The show couldn't even attract a sponsor.
The Mercury Theatre on the Air was a weekly show which would dramatise classic literature. But despite of its high quality, very few people took notice of the show until its broadcast of the famous War of the Worlds episode.
They set their sights on War of the Worlds, a novella by the father of sci-fi, H.G. Wells. Just 6 days before Halloween Eve, Wells ordered staff writer Howard Koch to update this 1898 tale set in Victorian England into an edgy, modern American thriller.
It basically becomes almost a whole new story. I mean, they've got the title, but they can't do it in the modern day without making a lot of changes. And Koch kept trying to beg out of it and saying, I can't do it, and they kept saying, you have to.
Whether or not the panic in the streets after this broadcast is true is a subject for another video, but we just heard that Howard E. Koch was asked to write the script. But Orson Welles would take a large amount of the credit for the adaptation.
An accident again. We just wanted to do a science fiction show, and that was the show we picked on, and it turned out to be rather boring, so we brought it up to date and tried to freshen it up with as many topical, relevant allusions as we could. And as a result of that, we caused a national panic.
At the time of broadcast, Orson was working every night of the week, either directing or starring in the theatre, sometimes even both. When would he have time to write?
But that's the way you used to do all the shows. They'd get it ready, and then you'd come in and they did a recording of the show with not the real cast, with a skeleton cast of cheap actors and the sound effects in the script. And I would sometimes listen to it and always read their script, and I had 4 days until I had time to rewrite it or get another writer, everything, and go again. That was the way it went. But the actual recording was done in...
There was never recorded, it was live.
But the preparation took 1 day.
That's right.
With all the actors.
A short day, yeah. About 5 or 6 hours a minute.
I'd like to read you a telegram. Mr. Orson Welles, Paris, France. Dear Orson, I would consider it an honor if you would find the time to appear on my opening television show, Dean Martin. Of course, I was delighted, but I've never done this kind of show before, and I wanted to make sure I'd have enough rehearsal, so I wired back, please advise me of my rehearsal dates. And this is what I got back from Dean. Dear Orson, your rehearsal dates will be Kathy, Margie, and Roberta, in that order. That's my kind of a guy. So here I am. And I must say that in all my years in movies and on the stage, I've never seen anything quite like it. Except maybe from my days in radio. I didn't rehearse then either. But it was for a different reason. We were doing so many shows in those days, there wasn't time to rehearse. I can remember NBC in New York. I was acting at 30 different radio shows a week, and they had an elevator set aside just to get me from studio to studio on time. That's really true. So I was leaving the elevator, someone would throw a script in my hands and say, page 36, you're a 90-year-old cowboy. And I'd say, it's awful lonesome up here in the saddle ever since my old horse died. And back to the elevator to another studio where I'd be a doctor. I hate to disillusion you, nurse, but an apple a day will not keep me away. And down 6 floors to Studio A in Fu Manchu. The cause of death was ancient Chinese murder weapon. Victim beaten to death with soggy egg roll. And down the hall to Studio B where I was in a soap opera. You know, in that soap opera, I had a girl in the rumble seat of a car for 30 weeks, and what really went on in that rumble seat, only the shadow knew. Oh yes, the shadow. I was the shadow. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows.
I don't know if the original draft of the script still exists before Orson came in and made his changes, so it's hard to tell if it would warrant taking a credit or not. But I do know if you purchase a copy of the original show on record, it credits Howard Koch as the writer and Howard Koch alone. If you were to listen to the show, the only credit goes to the director.
Ladies and gentlemen, the director of the Mercury Theatre and star of these broadcasts, Orson Welles.
The NBC Blue Network brings you another episode of Johnny Pistachio, Private Eye.
The city was asleep as I returned to my apartment. Everything was quiet. Except for the occasional sound of a tugboat in the East River, and once in a while, a taxi below my window. The tower clock was striking 3.
While Orson Welles may not be able to take full responsibility for the text of The War of the Worlds, he was the head writer on other episodes.
The transmissions had, of course, continued throughout Too Much Johnson. Treasure Island, A Tale of Two Cities, The 39 Steps, a triple bill including My Little Boy, Abraham Lincoln, Arthur Schnitzler's Anatole. There were 2 more programs out of the originally contracted 9, The Count of Monte Cristo and The Man Who Was Thursday, this last adapted at his own insistence by Welles himself. Welles having refused even to give it a dress rehearsal, it transpired during transmission that the show was clearly running at least 13 minutes short. Houseman thrust various great novels into Welles's hand. He read sections from them as a trailer for future shows, to the great admiration of studio executives who naturally thought that the whole thing had been carefully planned. Welles never again attempted to adapt the show himself.
That is from the first of Simon Callow's wonderful 4-volume biography of Orson Welles. I have heard the story recounted elsewhere, and the excuse given for there not being a rehearsal was not because of Orson's refusal, but because there was no script. And the time that would have been allocated to preparation was instead used by Welles to write, and that's why it underran and had to be padded with book readings.
Tonight, the Columbia Broadcasting System, through its member stations coast to coast, and the network of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, has brought you a production of G.K. Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, by Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre on the air. The adaptation for radio was made by Mr. Welles.
Out of all of the episodes I've listened to, and I must admit I haven't listened to all of them, this is the least adapted, with large amounts of the text coming from the original book rather than being dramatised for the air. But the biggest thing of note is that whole thing about reading passages from books to fill dead air doesn't happen. The show runs a full 55 minutes.
Your relationship with Orson Welles pretty much broke up about this point, and he went to Hollywood.
Well, we all went to Hollywood. No, our relationship ended during the time we were in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
Then I came back and worked with Herman Mankiewicz on the first script of Citizen Kane. And then after that, I left him for good.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a song about you, Mr. Kane?
You buy a bag of peanuts in this town, you get a song written about you.
The movie that Orson and John Houseman left New York for Hollywood for was, of course, Citizen Kane.
He and Mankiewicz agreed to write together. Mankiewicz was signed up to write a screenplay, but was given to understand, it was in the contract, that he would not receive any credit for it whatever, which was very common in Hollywood and very common in Mankiewicz's life as well. There were many films on which he wrote, and many of the Hollywood writers didn't get credits for the scene they wrote or the wonderful, plot structure that they created. So Mankiewicz wrote his enormously long screenplay, which was called American, and Welles himself had written another one called John Citizen, which nobody's ever seen since. But when Welles then, seeing Mankiewicz's screenplay and realizing that basically it was pure gold from his point of view, but had two problems. One, that it was too explicitly about William Randolph Hearst. Secondly, it was just too long for words. And Welles went to work, and here we see an instance of his, I think you really can use the word genius about this. He was an editor of genius. He was able to whip any script into astonishing shape. He wasn't so good at generating scripts himself, but he was wonderful at taking other people's work and radically improving it.
There was a lot of controversy around the movie Citizen Kane when it was released, but who wrote the script was not it. It was only when the American film critic Pauline Kael published her article Raising Cain that any real doubt arose.
I thought it was a very, very cruel, mean-spirited, and essentially destructive job. I think the thing was a perfectly clear attempt to assassinate Orson, trying to take away the one picture that that everybody said, well, he did make Citizen Kane. So she wanted to say, well, he didn't.
Bogdanovich published his response to Kael in a short essay, and through his friendship with Welles was able to clarify the other side of the story and to detail his evidence against the allegations, including those of Mankiewicz's secretary, that Welles wrote none of the shooting script.
The point is that most of Orson's writing was done with his secretary, with his writing. I found his secretary who said, well, I told her that, and she said, well, I don't know what all that stuff was that I was typing then.
I didn't want to set up a battery of anxieties about who contributed what to this scene or that. I mean, I think that's fruitless. Welles's reputation as an artist certainly doesn't depend on whether he wrote Citizen Kane.
Kael now seeks to distance herself from the controversy she started up.
This is from Peter Bogdanovich's book-length interview with Welles.
Now, about the writing of the script, which is another legendary story because everybody takes credit for it. That is, people assign credit, like, as you said, your old enemy John Powsner assigns credit for the script to Mankiewicz. It's very funny that he does that because he deserves some credit himself. It's very perverse on his part because he's actually a junior writer on it and made some very important contributions himself, really. Yeah. And for some curious reason, he's never wanted to take that bow. It gives him more pleasure just to show that I didn't write it. No, it was such an argument about it with Mankiewicz's friends when the picture turned out well, and I want to take credit with him that the secretary who'd kept all the scripts, the ones that I'd done, the ones he did, presented them, and it was decided that by the lawyer that there could be no, if a mistake into arbitration, there would be even question whether he got it, and certainly no question about whether I did, because the scripts were dated.
Robert Carringer joined the fray. He spent months studying all 5 drafts of the script. Kael, he claims, only looked at 2, the first and the last.
I can tell you, and this has been a secret of the files for many years, but when Mankiewicz finished his first turn on the script, he gave it in to Welles at the studio. He went off on another project. He went off to MGM to write the first draft of Madam X. He got no credit on it, by the way. There's an irony for you. That just happened to be the month in which Welles returned from New York, took the script in hand, and I can pinpoint for a period of about 20 days when there were approximately 115 revision pages. Okay, now that's a substantial portion of a script.
But did Welles actually write original material himself? Carringer discovered this cable from John Houseman to Mankiewicz, received your cut version, also several new scenes of Orson's.
That there should have put this argument to bed, but there was the matter of credit. It was in Orson Welles' contract that he would produce, direct, act and write the movie. It didn't say co-write, and Orson thought that RKO could use that loophole in order not to pay him his fee.
I'm sorry. This is the shooting script we've been using every day. I thought you'd like to see it.
When it comes to screenplays, there are a lot of rules to determine who gets credit and how. If two writers are credited with the word "and" between their names, then the second one rewrote the first. If they have an ampersand separating them, then they wrote together. I don't know how they came to the agreement in the end, but the final credit, as seen in the movie, reads original screenplay by Herman J. Mankiewicz, Orson Welles. There is no ampersand or and. Both men clearly worked on the text, but the collaboration was a messy one, which I guess is why it was not repeated.
Orson Welles first came up with the idea for Monsieur Verdoux. 3 months after the release of Citizen Kane, Welles thought of making a film about the French wife murderer Henri Désiré Landru, and proposed the lead role to Chaplin, whose Great Dictator was then a great success. Chaplin saw in it the possible basis for a comedy of murders, which he would himself direct. In July 1941, he bought the story idea from Welles.
Monsieur Verdoux is the movie on Charlie Chaplin's filmography which is least like the others. Still a comedy, but incredibly dark. It follows the title character as he murders for money.
However, tell me about yourself.
I much prefer to talk about something pleasant.
Orson Welles' only credit on the finished film would be based on an idea by. This is a clip of him talking to the filmmaker Henry Jaglom about the matter, taken from the BBC show The Lost Tapes of Orson Welles, which would also be the basis of Jaglom's book My Lunches with Orson.
Then he came to me. He was being sued for plagiarism. And he said, I have to say that I've written everything I ever did. And he said to me the day when Monsieur Verdoux was running Schwemmett for me, which I wrote. And if I put it on the screen, that you wrote the story and the screenplay, where goes my case? I'll put you back the minute the case is over.
And you never did.
Never met.
So the credits
never met with it.
So you said okay. Settle the case.
And opened in New York. One day later it says, based on a suggestion by Orson. And I've said that ever since.
Do you know whether Chaplin had everything planned out or did a lot of improvising?
He didn't improvise much, but he didn't plan the picture structure. He just don't. He always had 6 gag men.
Chaplin had 6 gag men?
Yes.
I'm devastated. Chaplin had gag men?
He likes to say that as part of his harumph, his posture of himself as a kind of grouchy, whatever that is. But the irony, of course, was that it was Orson who had ruined a great career as well, talking about somebody else. And I always felt that that was why he got so mad.
Because with Chaplin, there's this thing about Monsieur Verdoux, where on the credits of Monsieur Verdoux it says, I think, based on an idea by Orson Welles. And suddenly he comes out and says, I wrote the script, and he took the credit away from me.
I am not a historian. Some of this stuff seems like it could only have come from Orson. And I actually just saw Monsieur Verdoux a few nights ago. It seemed at the time ridiculous. It seemed that Chaplin didn't need to borrow from anyone. Then he mentions that Chaplin stole from everyone.
Out of all the films discussed in this video, I think this is the least likely to have been written by Welles himself, though he was paid £5,000 for the idea, so there must have been some written material somewhere.
In later years, Welles claimed that he himself had written a script for the film, but this is unlikely. Certainly the written agreement between Chaplin and Welles makes no mention of it.
This is how Welles would speak of Charlie Chaplin, years later, when talking to Peter Bogdanovich.
You once said that the only men in movies honestly deserving of the title genius were Chaplin and Griffith. You still agree?
I suppose so.
Even though you don't like Chaplin that much.
I do like Chaplin, I just don't think he's funny. He is funny because everybody else laughs at him. I just am incapable of laughing at it. But I admire him enormously, and he fascinates me. to watch. There's a wonderful joke in the Churchill spot I'm doing on the TV show, where Sarah Churchill tells it. Chaplin went to Churchill's house for lunch. Churchill asked him what his next part was going to be, and Chaplin said, "Jesus Christ." And there was a long pause, and Churchill said, "Have you cleared the rights?" Marvelous.
Oh, I was going to tell you about Holly Martins, an American. Came all the way here to visit a friend of his. The name was Lime, Harry Lime.
The Carol Reed movie, The Third Man, is by far the best film Orson Welles was ever in but didn't direct. It's a thriller set in war-torn Vienna. Holly Martin, played by Joseph Cotten, arrives in the city to find that his friend, Harry Lime, has died. Or has he?
At an earlier time, when I was being interviewed in another language, I gave the impression that I'd somehow co-directed my scenes and that's not true. And I never meant to say that or give that impression. I was, however, to a large extent, the author of the dialogue of Harry Lime.
Orson Welles, alias the Third Man, Harry Lime.
Harry, get away. The police are outside. Quick.
His first statement is fact. The second, fiction. The real author of The Third Man is Graham Greene.
This arena documentary, Shadowing the Third Man, can be found on the special edition DVD and Blu-ray of the movie. And as you've just heard, they claim that Orson Welles had no part in writing the script. But if you buy the script, which is credited to Graham Greene, you'll see that you have the text for each scene, but there's a footnote on almost every page how the text differs from the film. And there's one scene of note which is very different from what is written.
Don't be so gloomy. After all, it's not that awful. Well, what the fella said. In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So long, Holly.
This is Graham Greene himself talking about the matter.
Could Mr. Greene clear up some of the truths and half-truths about the Third Man, who wrote what and how it sort of came about?
The screenplay was entirely mine, except for the passage about the cuckoo clocks, which was written by Orson Welles. Orson Welles, I believe, has claimed that he wrote a lot of the script, but in actual fact, that was the only passage which he wrote.
Orson actually only claimed that he wrote a great deal of his own dialogue, and seeing Harry Lime only speaks in one scene, it wouldn't take a hell of a lot of rewriting to make that claim. Greene states that he only wrote the cuckoo clock speech, but that's not the only change annotated in the script. Even if we only look at that one scene, there are more changes. Of course, they could have been made by anyone in the production, not just Orson.
But that is what I do when I act in other people's pictures. I never argue about the direction, but I usually come up with a rewritten scene. That's the headache they have to put up with. And then if they don't like it, I'll go back to the other. But I go back home at night and write next day's scene and hope they'll take it instead of what it is. But I never would tell a director, would you do that or something, unless they asked me.
The Third Man was a hit, and it led to a prequel series being made for the radio, starring Orson Welles as the same charming bastard he made famous. It was called The Lives of Harry Lime.
That was the shot that killed Harry Lime. He died in a sewer beneath Vienna, as those of you know who saw the movie The Third Man. Yes, that was the end of Harry Lime. But it was not the beginning. Harry Lime had many lives, and I can recount all of them. How do I know? It's very simple. Because my name is Harry Lime.
This series is really rather good, and it is in the public domain, so it can be downloaded from many places. This is the legendary producer Harry Alan Towers of the Towers of London talking about the production.
I used to use good, experienced American radio writers to do the scripts. I'd been doing the series for several months when Orson came to me and said, "What do you pay for these scripts, Harry?" And I said, "Well, I pay $1,000. I use good American writers, and they're appreciative for the $1,000. Orson, of course, was short of money. I said, "I'll write you 6 scripts for $6,000.
One of those episodes was about a mysterious man named Arden, sometimes pronounced Arcadian, who had lost his memory.
One late afternoon a couple of years ago, a plane was sighted about 70 miles out of the Orly airport in Paris. It was a private plane of medium size, and nobody was in it. Nobody at all. The plane, keeping its course steadily toward Paris, was flying itself. Why was it empty? Who had been flying it? And why and in what circumstances had they left it? Well, thereby hangs the tale.
A few weeks later, there's a knock on the door of my apartment, which indeed is just one floor below where I live now in the same address, 84 Hallam Street. And I go to the door, my secretary goes to the door, and there's a very nice German gentleman, and he had in his hand copies of the scripts. And I said, "Yes, I recognize those scripts." He said, "I wrote them, and I haven't been paid." So it happened that very afternoon. I was doing another show with Orson, and when the show was over, I said, "Orson, I had a visitor today, and he produced copies of those 6 scripts which you sold me." And he said he wrote them, and he hadn't been paid. Without a flicker of guilt, Orson said, "Don't pay him. They weren't very good scripts."
Orson Welles is credited for those scripts in the published version, but the actual shows as broadcast have no writing credits. I assume he did some rewriting on them before turning them in, but I have no hard proof of that.
And I'm sort of elegantly pole vaulting over a film called Mr. Arden, which is, I think, Wells's one absolute failure. A film that he'd written himself from scratch. Very unusual for him to do that.
On December 25th, an aeroplane was sighted off the coast of Barcelona. It was flying empty. Investigation of this case reached into the highest circles, and the scandal was very nearly responsible for the fall of at least one European government. This motion picture is a fictionalized reconstruction of the events leading up to the murder and to the appearance last Christmas morning of the empty plane.
The basis of this movie was, of course, the Arden radio show from the lives of Harry Lime, though in this version Orson would be playing Arden and the Harry Lime character would be renamed Guy Van Straten and played by the actor Robert Arden, whose career basically peaked with this movie.
Scorpion wanted to cross a river, so he asked the frog to carry him. "No," said the frog, "no, thank you. If I let you on my back, you may sting me, and the sting of a scorpion is death." Now, whereas the scorpion is the logic of death, for scorpions always try to be logical. "If I sting you, you will die. I will drown." So the frog was convinced and allowed the scorpion on his back, but just in the middle of the river, he felt a terrible pain and realized that after all, the scorpion had stung him. "Logic," cried the dying frog as he started under bearing the scorpion down with him. "There is no logic in this." "I know," said the scorpion, "but I can't help it. It's my character. Let's drink the character."
This film exists in many different versions. It seems that Orson Welles was always changing his mind and rewriting on set. This is the leading man, Robert Arden, talking to Simon Callow.
And he said, "Right, be at the studio at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. You'll be picked up. We start shooting." Got to the studio. And this was the first day. We spent a whole day lighting up. Shot the first sequence at 11 o'clock at night. Got through the sequences by about 3 in the morning. Went home. Came back to the studio the following day to be told, Hakim and I, as we were waiting, Orson came with a fantastic idea. I'm changing it all. Now, all the stuff you've done, I'm rewriting that, and we're going to do it in flashbacks now. And I said, but if you're rewriting it, will it work? He said, yeah, we'll dub it all later.
This film, like much of Orson Welles' work, was not a financial success. But they did release a novelisation attributed to Welles to promote the film.
When you wrote the novel of Arden, did you plan it?
I didn't write the novel of Arden, or have I ever read it.
You didn't write it?
Didn't write one word of it and never read it.
Well, how could they release it with your name on it?
Maurice Bessy wrote it in French, published it with Dolivet, my partner in the movie's permission.
Not yours?
Not mine. I have neither written it nor read it.
But that's rather awful. I mean, it's been published in every language.
I know.
And assigned by you.
I know. It was sold. I gave permission for a serial to be made, to be sold to the Daily Express, to run with my name. Because who cares in a newspaper for 6 issues just before the opening in London to sell it? And that permission apparently went for everything. And I never bothered to stop. I didn't give a damn about this. I never read it. I've seen it in bookstores and all that.
That's very funny because it's quoted in a couple of books, about saying, and they talk about the style of the writing and that being rather simple and and I read this section, I keep saying, she's really not very good, and I thought, well, so he wasn't he wasn't in a particularly, it doesn't have any particular style at all.
No, some hack did it. I don't think even Bessy. I think he got some hack and worked on it. It was originally in French, and then for some French newspaper then sold to the English to promote the picture. Well, I never got a dime from it either.
Well, it was published in hardcover?
Yes.
Here.
And in England, and in the continent. All that. I've never read it, much less written it.
That's not really funny.
Well, it is, I think.
Well, it is funny, I suppose, but all those poor people who read it and thought they were reading your work.
I know, well, yeah, well, it's good for them.
I never read it either, because I have it, but I never read it.
Well, I'll sign it for you. Okay.
That's very interesting, because this is Robert Arden talking about the same matter.
Well, while we were doing the movie, he was writing the novel.
Now, he really was writing that.
Oh, yeah.
Opinions are terribly divided about it. A lot of people say that it was really written by Maurice Bessy. It was really written by Orson.
I was there while he was doing.
Really?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, he had an English secretary.
Anne Rogers?
No. Can't remember her name. She was brought in specially.
Yeah.
And all she did was sit with him, and every fair spare moment he was dictating the novel. Maurice Bessy may have done some rewrites on it. Maurice Bessy may have done the French translation.
Yeah.
And Maurice certainly did another book that Orson and he wrote together, which was done in French.
Yeah.
I have a copy of that.
What's that?
There have been a lot of arguments over the years about what Orson did or didn't write. It seems to me that he struggled with first drafts. When adapting a text, as Orson did in the theatre and radio, you don't start with a blank page. When writing original scripts, the page is very blank and it can be hard to know where to start. But what people don't consider, and this video hasn't until now, is the material that he wrote that no one contests. Touch of Evil is a very fine movie with dialogue as sharp as anything you could find in Citizen Kane. All of Chimes of Midnight surpasses any cuckoo clock speech. The Lady from Shanghai surpasses all of the lives of Harry Lime.
I said to them, well, what if he did something brand new, like Citizen Kane was brand new, about America at the end of the century, the way the Citizen Kane was about America at the beginning of the century. And it sounded like a good piece of salesmanship. And they said, that's great. I said, well, he happens to be working on that, which he wasn't. So I went back and said to Orson, listen, there is a possibility of getting financing, but not for any of the existing projects that you want to do, but for the one that you're going to write. He said, the one I'm going to write? And we had one of those lunches that ended with, I can't do it, and my saying, you must do it. And at 4 a.m, I got a phone call. He said, well, I've done 4 pages, but they're terrible. And the next day we went to lunch, and he had 31 pages. And again, he thought they were terrible. They were, in fact, magnificent. We worked this way through the entire script.
After 3 months, they had some studio interest for a script called The Big Brass Ring, a political drama about a young Kennedy-like presidential candidate.
Orson Welles died of a heart attack at the age of 70. He was found at his typewriter, where he was working on new material, which in my mind is the Viking funeral for writers. This video has taken a ridiculous amount of research, and that included purchasing movies I already have on Blu-ray because they wouldn't digitise and I couldn't source them other places. But if you've enjoyed this, let me know in the comments. Or better still, you can send me the price of a coffee on Ko-Fi. There's a link below if you want it. I'm Scott Kingsnorth, and I'm making a movie.